welcome everybody. Good to see you here, good to be here. Now I know we're being recorded and everything, so I don't expect much of but I'd like you to take, before we start, 5 minutes to talk a little bit to your best friend or somebody else in the room about what you think ethnicity is. Okay, what is ethnicity and how can we see it archaeologically? And when you leave, I'm going to ask you to leave me a little exit paper, okay? Where you write then down if you think any of those case studies can be explained with ethnicity. But first of all, take 5 minutes, right? Come up with some stuff. It doesn't have to be correct. Nobody knows at the end of the day. Okay, how are you getting on? You've all got something? Sweet. What do we think ethnicity is? It's the black pen, so it has to be serious. Just shout in, because I don't know who any of you are. This is your great advantage today. Yes?
It's a definition of people from genetic perspective.
Okay. Ethnicity is maybe genetic.
Maybe some cultural traditions.
Uh-huh. Sorry about the terrible writing. Yes?
Maybe some means of governing.
Okay. Uh-huh. Is everybody happy with all of these? What about this issue, for example? We happy with this? If somebody is genetically different, how different? How big is an ethnicity?
Maybe more of a geographic proximity than genetic.
Okay. Is it like maybe we can, genetic, maybe geographic? Yeah?
These traits maybe could be learned by being born and living into this culture, not specifically just by having the lineage.
Yeah, yeah. So is it more traditions? How do these matters hang together, right? How about language? Is language important? Yes, okay. All right. I mean, there's very many different things here, because ethnicity today, we use it in a very loose sense, right? So, especially if you see, let's say, American or British films, they say ethnicity when they want to say race, but they don't want to use race. Right? So then it's very much about some aspects of genetic identity, but not all. Then you have government. That's like more like nationality, you know, people living in the same place. But then let's say, for example, Greek people. There's Greek people everywhere. They have a very strong sense of being Greek, even if they live in Australia, but they have very different governments. Right? Then you have language, of course, that could be something. But then the Swiss, are they 4 ethnicities, 1 ethnicity, just a nationality? Okay? So ultimately, it's all these things and none of these things alone. Okay? So genetic identity, yeah, maybe, but then genetic identity can be very broad, and people can really hate each other, even if they're genetically the same. Again, you're different people. So it's a very complicated thing. And archaeologically, we can only ever get a subset of these, like not that, okay, not really this, kind of that, and sort of that, but Okay. So the question is this concept even really still useful? Okay. And this I have found my answer to, but at the end of today, I'd be very interested what your answer is. Okay, so does ethnicity help us at all? I'm going to give you my definition as well in a minute. Okay, but ethnicity has come back to archaeology largely because of this idea of prehistoric migrations So in a research historical kind of way, migrations were the one means by which different archaeological cultures could come into being. Okay? People didn't like to change by themselves very much, so if there was a fast change, it meant a new group arrives from the outside. So part of our project that Peter mentioned in Oslo with the Center for Advanced Studies was to try and find out whether we can think about migration not at this level of very large groups, but at the level of smaller groups, right? Maybe individuals, but really small groups, and how this works for their sense of identity. Okay? So for this, we needed to look at migration and mobility a little bit together, and also to look at how people, when they move, then find new mechanisms to make a new tradition, a new whole, a new identity group that we may or may not call an ethnicity. Okay, so we're going to try and look today at the smaller individual scale. And part of the reason for this is also because of the new narratives. So because some of these narratives that have come back also to haunt us in the press are all based on the genetic data, okay? And they make very big statements then afterwards based on the genetic data that we as archaeologists would see a little bit more critically. Okay? So DNA reveals god kings existed in Ireland. There's not so much that DNA can say about forms of government, for example, directly. Okay? Should we really call somebody the most murderous people of all time? That's quite a statement. Okay? There's a lot to compare yourself to here. Okay? Or then here, these sorts of gender ideas. Farming women, tamed nomadic warriors is quite a weird story. So we have to look a little bit at how, if you just look at the big scale of the genetic movement, we leave the field open also to really bring in old cliches. Okay, so we need to theorize also these smaller scale interactions. Okay, so this personal scale is necessary because when we talk in this large culture, historical, and archaeogenetic view, we look just at these big colored blobs. Okay, that move around with all these arrows that suggest exactly that people move once and in one direction. They know exactly where they're going. They're a homogeneous group inside the blob, and then they create another homogeneous group that is a different blob. Right? Homogeneous inside, but very different between the colors. No interaction there because this is blue and this is orange, right? And this is too simplistic. Okay? So today we're going to go through a few of these. Are they animated for some reason? Yes. We're going to go through a few of these case studies. We're going to, of course, start with the Linearbandkeramik because we all know and love it. Okay, so that's the green blob. Then we're going to look a little bit around at the Alpine Foreland, so the Hogan culture, which lives kind of there. All right, I now have the fancy thing. So it lives kind of there. All right, Hogan Wartberg. Then we're going to go to Salzmunde, which is going to be sort of here. And then eventually we'll look at the corded ware in Norway, which, as you can see, has been left grey here because people are always very pessimistic about the cultural possibilities of Norwegian archaeology. But we'll try a little bit there as well. Okay. So part of the problem of thinking of ethnicity as blobs has been that we've tried to also find the migration model that explains all of the European Neolithic. So, as we've just discussed, change comes from the outside. It's these big groups of people that are moving. This is from a 1920s school book and shows the migration, I think, of the Swiss at the times of Caesar, the Helvetii, when they migrate outwards. Right? So these mass migrations are this kind of permanent one-way move by this one group of people who also then don't really change their identity. Right? They're supposed to move as one clearly defined grouping, and then they just plonk themselves down in this sort of wave of demographic advance. Okay. We've also recently discussed on the basis of DNA and isotopes that this largely happens because it's already a very patriarchal society, which then has a patrilocal settlement pattern, so women move to these new husbands. Right? We have made a big dichotomy between people sitting still, which we think is what they should be doing. Sedentism is a big thing in the Neolithic. Okay? So once you've found your place, you don't want to move, and you only move if there is some kind of crisis. So there's this big schism between actually mobility and sedentism. And then we don't quite know how to deal with the migrants. A little bit like in modern day politics, we see two scenarios there. Either they move in and they have a low social status, or they move in and they cause massive disruption and take over. Okay? So on the basis of aDNA, which came very, well, we were not prepared for it, let's say, a lot of these unreflected assumptions from culture history have sort of crept back in. Okay? And this happened at a bad place for archaeologists because we had just gotten very comfortable with our post-processual narratives that, you know, identities were creative and everyone could be what they wanted and they could kind of bricolage and so on. Right? And now all these kind of old narratives were flooding back in quickly. Right? A lot of new data. Everything was scientifically proven. Everything we'd said in the last 10 years was wrong. Right? And we were like, whoo, the steamroller that had overtaken us. Right? And everybody knew that DNA tells you about the real identity of people, the scientifically proven identity of people. Okay? Which is, of course, a little bit problematic because who we are DNA-wise is only a very small fraction of all of our ancestors. You know, a lot of them have been filtered out just accidentally. And also it has nothing to do with how we necessarily perform our identities in everyday life, where we feel at home. So these were kind of the first 5-6 years of the aDNA revolution. Eventually now archaeologists have gotten off the track and geneticists have stopped riding the train. And we're talking a lot better with each other. So how can we go from here? So for the rest of today, I'll try and be strict with myself and use mobility, especially when I mean sort of planned economic activities, seasonal or daily, okay, but not out of the ordinary. And to use migration as a kind of specific subset of mobility, that means a longer term, permanent change of residence, right, of long duration. It's possible for people to return, but they need to cross a significant cultural spatial boundary, and they need to stay away for a long time for it to count as a migration. In modern literature, it's supposed to be half a year or longer, but we don't have that kind of very narrow chronology. So, but enough to manifest isotopically, let's say, as a kind of frame. Okay, and so of course, I don't know, it looks like I'm trying to shoot Gordon Chant. I wasn't. So this is the traditional view of cultures as ethnic groups, of course. It's very easy when you have this kind of system, which is in itself obviously an achievement of scholarship, but to think of all these little groups as very much, you know, bounded in space and in time. Right? There's a few dotted lines somewhere, right there. Right? But in general, it's supposed to be that everything that's inside these little boxes is supposed to behave in one way. Okay? And so it's, as you know, certain times of remains, certain pots and implements and ornaments, etc., constantly recurring together. And we very much assume that such a complex is the material expression of what we today would call a people. Right? And by looking at these cultures and how they replace each other, we can write prehistory. We can have a narrative of what happens and who replaces who. Of course, all this has been critiqued many, many, many times from a methods point of view as well as from a theoretical point of view. But this has left us with using this terminology of culture groups, right? And always saying in the back of our minds, well, we know they're really a fiction, but then not really treating them as a fiction. Right? It's still the building blocks we more or less use. But in the social sciences, ethnicity has become something quite a lot more open. Okay? So people like this very stern-looking gentleman here, Max Weber, right? Don't joke with him. For him, ethnicity was something that was a belief in shared origin. So you didn't actually have to have a shared genetic origin. You just needed to believe that there was something that had brought you together. And it could be a common ancestor. It could be a belief in sort of shared family relationships. Or it could also be a specific event. For example, a migration event, right, that brought you together as a group of people moving, right, and that then caused you to become a new identity group vis-a-vis others. Okay, so these origin points can be quite flexible. But for example, we see these sorts of ethnicities a lot in the United States in about the 17th and 18th century, when there is a lot of impact from settler colonialism. Many Native Americans are dying out of disease and so on. And so the survivors come together to form new ethnic groups which move to new places. Okay? And they now, from this day on, call themselves the such and such. Right? The Broadertown Indians, for example. Right? So this is then their shared origin narrative. Also here is Fredrik Barth, a Norwegian social anthropologist, who in the 1960s introduced this idea that in addition to this sort of shared primordial sense, this belief in common origin, right, often in times immemorial, he said there's also a situational part to ethnicity. Right? So that ethnicity, for example, is also something that, that you to an extent can choose. Right? You might have the opportunity, for example, in his case study, which was in northern Pakistan somewhere, ethnicity was very much about the economic choices that people made. So your ethnicity was determined not by your origin, but by whether you were part of the agricultural half of the production or more the shepherding half of the production. And it was possible for people to move between these groups and in a sense change their ethnic name through life, depending on where they saw the best opportunities for themselves. Right? His work has also been criticized in that it's not just you who makes this attribution, it's also other people. Right, the Romans, for example, are very good with this. They go around the world and go, you, God, you're a barbarian. And they give people names from the outside. That's also a power thing. Right? Or in the British Empire later, for example. So we have what you call yourself, and then you have ethnicity as something pushed on yourself by others. Right? So there's a very interesting triangle. So out of all this, archaeologically, right, we've now decided, or people like Dee Hu and Barbara Mills, who work on this in the US, have come to a sort of definition that tries to be a little bit of all three. And he said, well, it's explicit signaling behavior in dynamic situations. Right? So it's a mixture of what people feel they have as a common origin, of what they feel it is necessary in a given political situation to show that they are, and what others call them. Right? To use a kind of modern example, you could say that in a sense ethnicity is about a shared way of the good life, of values and so on. Right? This gives you a very, very broad ethnicity because, for example, most people in Europe like very similar things. Coffee shops, comfortable sitting rooms, those kind of things. The good life, democracy, right? But we are not all, some people like that, we're not all an ethnicity, okay? So this gives you a very broad kind of background, right? We have it here, this is the Norwegian National Day, the 17th of May, right? Which is not, it's a big day of ethnic marking, but it's more marking that everybody lives together in the society and shares the same value, and they all wave the flag at the king, etc., etc., etc. Right? But then ethnicity is also at the same time boundary signaling when you encounter others. So this is Belfast. I don't know who of you has been to Belfast, but even so many years after the peace agreement, there are still graffitis like this. Right? No Pope here, no Catholic people here. There are parts of the city that are green, and there are parts of the city that are white and red, and those people do not talk to each other, and you don't cross those boundaries. And then you have this here. This was a exhibition in London about how West Indians or Caribbean migrants found their place in the UK. And here there was very much pressure to fit in. Right? This was a migrant group that arrived in the 50s and the 60s when there was still a lot more racism in the UK than there is now. And so outwardly, these people would have to conform very much to the dominant society, but inside, in private, right, they could make some design choices that the average British family would not make in this way. So ethnicity was something that was ascribed to them by others, but they also then performed sort of in private. So for us, for archaeologists, the question is then things like, which of these is it? Right? Ethnicity, to me at least, needs to have an encounter. It needs that people choose from all the many traditions that they have that make their good life, that they choose some which become an identifier that is explicitly communicated to others, like, for example, religion. Right? Then it starts to become ethnicity. It's an explicit dialogue between people. And we can look at this in various different scales. So one, of course, is the very large scale. For example, the Linearbandkeramik, which you have all known. Maybe I'll show you this first, yes. So you've seen this map many times. I think this is even probably quite an old one. But here, very optimistic dating, we could say. But nevertheless, a big spread over a very long distance, masses of territory that are covered. And there are no clear push factors. There is actually a lot of empty space that the very earliest LBK leaves out. They seem to hop very large distances. And so this migration, it has been argued in the literature, is not because of necessity. It's not because people run out of agricultural land to feed their children or something. And it's not poor people that migrate, because migration of this kind is very expensive. Okay, you need to have a lot of surplus in order to send a group of people with enough cattle and sheep and pigs and so on to establish a new herd that is viable in the new place. They need to have enough grain to keep them fed during the journey, and then to sow the field, and then to stay alive until their own grain has grown. That's a lot of stuff that they need to take with them. Okay? And maybe they also need nice presents to sort of give to the people they encounter along the way. Right? So this system is actually very expensive. This migration over long distances is very, very expensive. Okay? But this is not how we've traditionally seen it. Right? Traditionally, we've seen this based on isotopic evidence mainly, as a migration that is only undertaken, as mobility that is only undertaken by a few people because they have to. So this was a large-scale study that Alistair Whittle and many others did in Cardiff in the, oh God, a long time, in prehistory, some years ago. And they found out like several hundred LBK skeletons were analysed, and we found two main patterns. The first one that has sort of remained common knowledge, in a sense, is that women migrate more often over the course of their lifetime than men. So in this graph, everything that's sort of to the left of here is the local loess signature. So there might be, of course, people moving around from one loess patch to the other. This we cannot see with this method. Okay? But everybody that's to the right of here has definitely come from a different kind of geological substrate when they were children, normally uplands or something, and moved to the loess. And as you can see, most of these people are women, and only a few of them are men. So this then became a narrative that it's women who are maybe even hunter-gatherer women, that was since then disproven at the time, who live in the uplands and they move over time to live in their husband's village. So this is patrilocality. In addition, it was found that among the men, right, fewer of them move. But of the ones that do, which is kind of from here, most of them did not have a polished stone axe. The majority of people with the polished stone axe remained on the loess. Okay, great. So this was interpreted as a kind of internal hierarchy among the men. The ones with the polished stone axe were said to be the ones that inherit the farm. Okay? And those others are their unhappy younger brothers for whom there aren't any opportunities at home, and therefore they need to migrate because they have to. Okay? Nobody really was so much worried about the status of these women. Okay? Once they've migrated, that's it. So migration here in these early models was really something that happens to people who don't have any other choices or any other opportunities. All right? But since then, on the basis more or less of classic archaeological survey, we've shown that actually there is a lot of mobility and of constant backwards and forwards throughout the LBK settlement system. So these are sedentary people in a very loose sense of the word. Over here you see the Lech Valley. How good is your German geography? So down here are the Alps, basically. Down there are the Alps, and that's the Danube. Right? So and Munich is kind of there. Okay, a bit further down. So we see in the first phase, the first pioneer settlement appears up here along the Danube. And then in phase B, they don't only sort of spread out, they also go as far south as you possibly can. Like with the kind of agriculture that they have at the time, this is really quite far. This is quite close to the Alps, right? We're pushing the boundaries here. And in fact, it doesn't initially work out. So in phase C, they've kind of gone back, like, oof, forget that. But this pessimism doesn't last long. And in phase D, they're already back down there and they're spreading all over the place. Right? So there's a constant pulsing in and out. And where we have whole settlements excavated, like here in the Rhineland, for example, we see a similar pattern also at the level of the household. So here you have the big site, Langweiler 8, that you've probably all been made familiar with, whether you wanted to or not. And in some phases, there is a lot of other sites in this landscape that are occupied. This one here is the cemetery, so nobody lives there. But like a lot of others, sometimes all these people have gone. There's a few more houses here, but some people must have gone completely, okay? And then a few phases further, then there's even more, and there's even people living in where the cemetery used to be. Right, poof, 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 in and out. So they must all be going somewhere or coming from somewhere. So there's actually a lot of coming and going all of the time. It's not just people who migrate because they don't have any other options. They just do it anyway. So why do they do it? This is Vaihingen in Baden-Württemberg, so southwest Germany, a little bit further west in the Lech Valley. And again, a very extensively excavated settlement. You can see the boundary of it sort of there. They never really finished it because that's LBK people. They just don't care. But very intensively excavated. And within it, the archaeologists identified sort of little micro-traditions, which they called neighborhoods or clans. So these were people, A, B, C, D, who made, all the people in Clan A made similar kinds of pottery. They had specific procurement networks for lithics. And they also had a different way of raising their crops. So if you looked at the weed flora, for example, the ones in A and B did a lot more intensive garden-style cultivation where they really looked after their plants, A and D it was. Okay, and so one explanation was that we have this kind of unequal settlement model. So if all these clans, it was argued, were equal in their hierarchical relations, then we would have this kind of cake model. We would have Vaihingen at the center, and each clan would have access to all the economic zones around the settlement equally. But this is not what we see, because A and D have monopolized the land closest to the village. That's why they can go in for this intensive garden-style cultivation, and they have pushed everyone else to the margins. And in fact, eventually, all these other people, they leave. Right? And it's argued that they leave because they are marginalized and of lower status. But that's only really one way of looking at the whole thing. Right? Because if we look at these yellow marked clans, then from the start, these have a more emphasis on keeping sheep and goat, for example. So they might from the start be using the landscape in a slightly different way, not because they're pushed out, but because this is their economic specialism that is based more on herding. Right? And they have made less of a commitment to agriculture from the start. So when they leave, this is also because they can. Right? And this is the principle of voting with your feet in many ethnographic studies. You say, well, mobility can also be, in a sense, a weapon. It's not that you are pushed out. It's that you're going, I don't like you anymore. You've been bullied. You've been bullying me enough. And now I'm leaving and you can do your own work. Right? So it's a resistance as well. And so this could also be driving LBK expansion. Okay. And as we say, these are not poor people who keep moving. Another study that was very recently published by Pere Gelabert and others, and I forgot to put you in the link, but I'm sure you have already read it, is on the Nitra cemetery, not so very far from here. And here the genetics team tried to sample all the skeletons. Not everybody had enough DNA preserved, but they succeeded in finding one very large kind of family grouping, which you see here, this sort of mafia clan, and then lots of smaller clusters of relations. So this is the big family grouping on the map. But if you look at it here, you can see it's 4 generations that are represented, the ones with writing in. Right? But there's also a lot of people who are missing. So we know we have this sort of grandchild, but both their parents aren't actually there. Right? It's just the grandparent there. And then we have these sorts of associated kind of cousins, like further away relationships. Right? So we have a set of people that are kind of quite close related who seem to start this off. But then we also have a lot of people who never made it onto the cemetery. Instead, we also have a lot of smaller groups of very closely related people, genetically closely related people. And sometimes they're very close together, like these three here are another set of something like cousins, maybe. It's obviously hard to say exactly what the relationship was, but a second degree or third degree relationship. Right? And sometimes they're quite far apart, like that person and that person. They're not really buried very close together. Okay. And we also have these sorts of alternative definitions of family. So this was the triple burial of a woman and two children who had been killed violently. Right? And it was always, and she's holding her hand over the big hole in the head of one of the children, like it's quite a little caring. She's holding them like this. So when they were excavated, of course, the idea was that she's the mother and the two children are hers. And the aDNA study could show indeed that these two children were siblings, I think a brother and sister, so first degree relationship. But this woman was not their mother. Okay? The closest she could have been was an aunt on the father's side. Okay? So a very different kind of family relationship that goes in here as well. Now, all of this still leaves some people that have no relations at all on this cemetery, no biological relations. Okay. Of those, more are women than men, but you know, both groups represented. But in terms of the ritual, these people don't stand out at all. The ritual is in Nitra very, very much the same. It's much more, much more stereotypical, shall we say, almost, than on many other cemeteries further west. So it's just left crouched, and they're all more or less sharing the same orientation, and very few people fall out of this. The further west you go, the more diverse this becomes. But here they're really all showing a unity in this burial ritual. And also very few people stand out in terms of their grave goods. It's almost like being buried on this cemetery created a community that was, in a sense, a much stronger community than just the biological relationships. Okay. The interesting thing was that, contrary to our expectations from the strontium, all the men with the polished stone axes were not related to each other. And in fact, some of them were not related to anybody. So nobody inherited this farm. Also, the people with the spondylos, or the imported shells, that had been sometimes argued to be a particularly rich family group, they were also not related to each other. So these were very much achieved goods over a lifetime rather than anything else. So the original excavator had been right there. So here we maybe see, at a time, this is an early cemetery, at a time when most people are migrating, maybe that's why so many are missing. Okay, we see a lot of mobility in and out. And the way to create a community, to create a sense of belonging, is maybe through this very common shared burial ritual that, in a sense, gives you a social kinship that is bigger than the biological kinship. For the LBK, of course, we also always have the question of what happens to the Mesolithic people. This, again, for a long time, we didn't really think about so much. It was assumed that they all just go away somewhere, or maybe just love farming and become farmers themselves. But now we can see more and more evidence that they actually survive for a very long time alongside the Bandkeramik juggernauts, migrants. So this is Saxony, I think. And you see here in red, in green are the Neolithic sites, and they're in the fertile river valleys, right? But the Mesolithic sites in blue are in very different parts of the landscape. And as more and more of them are dated, not just typologically by the lithics, but also with radiocarbon, there's more and more of these sites that we can see continue for several centuries, potentially, alongside this big new settlement in the river valleys. So there is coexistence in the landscape, even though genetically, these people seem to be staying very much apart. Okay. This is also happening elsewhere. This is the site of Bokelfen in the Rhinelands on the western border of the Bandkeramik. And again, it's typologically late Mesolithic, but quite a few of the hearts of the charcoal have been dated way into the Bandkeramik. So these people keep sitting in the sandy soils on the river bank, okay, while the agriculture is happening somewhere else. And in the West, of course, we also have the strange kind of pottery, Lahoguet pottery, Big-Light-Keramic pottery, Limburg pottery, all sorts of pottery that is being made that is not Linearbandkeramik, okay? And is not anything else that we know of, right? But that is created sort of locally, and it's argued to be made by foragers, by hunters and gatherers that continue to live in the surrounding environments and adopt some of the aspects of a Neolithic way of life, but not the whole package. And that they make these sorts of more Mediterranean-inspired, right, with this sort of, with this kind of garland decorations and these sort of ridges and so on. Yes, and we keep finding new ones of these that don't fit anywhere. So what happens to these hunter-gatherers eventually? Eventually, it's well possible that they then get replaced, but this is a very much longer-term issue than we previously thought. So we need to think about this coexistence between LBK and hunter-gatherers more intensively than we have been. Right? Eventually, in the later Bandkeramik, also Bandkeramik people start moving into the uplands. Right? This is here is a sinkhole on the Franconian Alp, and in it we were found some Bandkeramik sherds, and also they took pollen cores, and they could show that the landscape was increasingly used for grazing as the Neolithic progressed. Right? So even if Mesolithic people had been hiding again up there, over time, their networks would be increasingly disrupted and they would be maybe pushed more and more to the margin. But this is a much longer-term process. And in the western part of the LBK distribution, say in the Netherlands, we now know that this process is several hundreds, if not thousands of years. Right? There is a big hunter-gatherer aspect to the ancient DNA as well that we don't get in Central Europe. This here is the isotopic signatures from Herxheim. You probably heard of Herxheim. It's an enclosure in the Rhineland-Palatinate where I think 450 or so people have been found, fragmented, maybe eaten. We're not going to talk about any of those exciting things today. We're going to just talk about the isotopes. So a lot of those people have been sampled isotopically, and it turns out that very few of them actually fall into the local isotopic signature of the Herxheim site, while many, many, many others, right, come from a variety of different uplands. Right? But all the ones that people have looked at genetically have a typical farmer genetic signature. I know they're sampling more right now, so this may change, right? But it looks like over time, Bandkeramik people are moving out of the loess and are becoming sort of more disruptive to hunter-gatherers and more disruptive to each other, right? Because it's not like they're signaling their identity to others, right? They are creating boundaries, but they're creating mainly boundaries with other LBK people. Right? They're not so worried about the mesoliths, but they really hate each other. So here, for example, this boundary there between Upper and Lower Alsace. Okay? You can see this is based on pottery decoration, and we can see here some big stylistic provinces. So this is the sort of northwestern province, whatever, the northwestern province, the southwestern province, and these styles are all kind of similar. Right, but some people stand out. So the Palatinate, where Herxheim lies, they make this sort of pottery with the plastic decoration that nobody else really does. In Bavaria at the time, they make this. In the Paris Basin, they make that with the hanging. Like, this is basically not LBK anymore. What are these people doing? Okay, so it becomes a little bit more diverse, but the biggest boundary is between Upper and Lower Alsace. And this is just a few kilometers, maybe 10 kilometers. And in these 10 kilometers, I mean, there isn't a mountain range. There is nothing there. You can walk this in half an hour. Not quite, but you can walk this in a day for sure. And everything that can be different between these two is different. Right? The pottery tradition is different. The preferences in the longhouse architecture are different. The burial rite is. The stone procurement sources are. The economic choices, more pig or more cat, everything. Right? And they don't mix. They're traditions, they might mix genetically. But anyway, so here we definitely have, I would say, an ethnic boundary. Right? There's very strong signaling going on here. But it's unlikely to be necessarily a genetic boundary. They're all LBK people at one level. Whereas further west, right, we see the integration of very diverse people into the same kinds of settlements. So this is Curie-les-Chaudards-les-Fontinettes in the Paris basin. And here, this is they've excavated, again, this whole village in advance of some kind of construction work, gravel extraction, I think. And over time, you can see that there's a sort of quartering of the village. And these houses here that are particularly long, they prefer the use of cattle. They have mostly domesticated animals, like overwhelmingly over 80%. And they also make mostly just LBK pottery. And then you have this half of the village where the houses are maybe a little bit shorter. But here is the people who mainly keep sheep and goat. And then here is the people where 50% of the animal bone spectrum, so quite a lot of it, is made up by wild resources, in particular boar, also otters. And here you also find more experimentation with the pottery. They call it diversity in ceramic production, so these kinds of Limburg and La Hoguette wares and so on. So this is a group who may have hunter-gatherer origins, ultimately, right? But who live in this village and are integrated into one. Right? So the important thing for LBK people seems to be to differentiate themselves from other LBK people, not necessarily from hunter-gatherers who you can adopt. Right? And maybe this is also what in the end explains these large-scale violent events that happen. So Thalheim, for example, in the western part, again, a large scale, 36 people, men, women, and children, all just thrown into this pit. And it's only 36 people because we haven't excavated the whole of it. There's likely quite a few more. And all of them, or most of them, with these multiple head wounds, so with these overkill wounds. And this is very, very likely, based on the shape of this, right? Being a forensic criminalist, this was another LBK person with a shoelast axe. There's not very many other options there. Okay. Other fine spots, like Vrable, of course, that you know more about than me, may be more complicated, but it's nevertheless something that is a signal largely to other LBK people. Right? These boundaries are something that you should take into account. So in sum, for this Bandkeramik case study, we can see that we have everyday mobility, yes, in the landscape, but we also have, it sort of blends into migration. So we have people who are very capable, who are very willing to move, who from the start make this commitment, for example, to be herders rather than farmers. And so these are also probably driving this large-scale migration into the further and further reaches of the Bandkeramik phenomenon. Right? And here, integration, with people moving around the landscape all the time, you also need strong ways of integrating these people into your village or into your community when they get there. And this can happen, for example, ritually, as we've seen in Nitra, with a very standardized burial ritual, or you can just integrate them in daily life. You can deal with this difference by having them in different quarters of the settlement, but otherwise doing a lot of things together. Okay? And the way we've thought about this as a cultural dualism between hunter-gatherers and farmers is not really where the nasty ethnic boundary lies. Okay? The hunter-gatherers, sure, probably they are a different ethnic group also, but they're hanging around in the landscape and they can be integrated, as in the Paris Basin. The people who you really don't like are other LBK people. And so it's here that the tension eventually builds up. So it's in these kind of smaller scales of social interactions, of neighbors falling out, of people 10 kilometers away being bad people, that we need to think of these dynamics. Right? And I've also given you, for some reason, a picture of a longhouse in the Borneo. I think this was to remind me about linguistic aspects. Because in these longhouse communities in Borneo, these are much longer longhouses than the Bandkeramik ones. They can be about 150, 200 meters long. And then there's lots of family compartments inside. Right? But these communities, even though they give themselves an ethnic name, right, we are the such and such today, they're very fluid in composition. So that in one longhouse, for example, you may have people from three linguistic groups who don't quite understand each other. They've just decided that for the time being, they are a longhouse community. And these then last a few decades, and then they reshuffle in the landscape. Right, so there is a lot of constant mobility also here. And maybe something like this is also going on with the LBK sites, right, with the longhouses there. Okay. So moving swiftly on. The Alpine Foreland. Right? Very different. This is mostly to show mobility. Right? Very different kind of architecture to the one we've seen. Basically no longer long houses, but short houses in two senses of the word. Short houses in the sense that they are not very big. So this is an LBK longhouse. You walk in the front door. This is an Alpine Foreland house. You walk in the front door and you hit your head on the back. Right? Short house with everything in it. Right? The oven and the hearth and the fishing net and so on. But they're also short in duration because they're built out in the lake or on the boggy ground. And so they have to be constantly repaired. The first repairs happen approximately after 1 or 2 years of you living in it. A major repair of like the carrying construction has to happen about 6 years after you've moved in. And in general, they're abandoned after 12 to 15 years of you living in it. Okay. A few settlements last longer, but that's the general. So it's a very, very quick turnover. And we know this, of course, because of the dendrochronology. We can see this very clearly. And there's often a pattern. So this is from eastern Switzerland, Arbon-Bleiche, and this is from western Switzerland, Zutz-Lattrigen. But the pattern is kind of the same. Right? You normally get the pioneer house. So in Arbon, it's this one. And in Zutz-Lattrigen, it's these two. And then maybe 1 or 2 more come. So this yellow one, these 2 grey ones. And then there's a big explosion. So over 2-3 years, you get all the blue. And they're like, this is becoming the place to be. Right? Lots of people are building their houses. And here also in these 2 phases, masses. Right? And then by the time the last person arrives, this one here squeezes themselves on the end. Probably the first ones are already thinking about moving. Been here for too long. Okay, these 2 there would squeeze themselves into the end, bits on the end. Okay, so this is a pattern that is very mobile, very unstable, but at the same time it lasts for millennia. So it's an adaptation to this landscape that has been very, very, very successful. So, but how this means that every time that you make a decision to move, you can also make a decision to move in with someone else. Okay, so this is not a village community that is static. You can, you will have multiple connections across the landscape, and you can choose to move in with someone else. And sometimes we can see this. So this is another Western Swiss example, Concis-Sukollascho. And there people, they live there, then they move away, then they return. This often happens. So you have several phases, right? Not continuous, but several interrupted phases at the same site. And over time, you can see here's Concis, and it's part of this pottery tradition with the sort of the cortaillot, these sort of lumpy bag-like pots. Okay, here are the Jura Mountains, and then on the other side of the Jura Mountains, you have the so-called NMB, the Neolithic Moyen Bourguignon. You don't have to remember that, but it sounds good. And every now and again, you can see over the mountain, people arrive that make different kinds of pottery. Right? This is a very clear introduction. It breaks with the chaîne opératoire. It breaks with the kind of temper that's in it. So somebody brings this tradition. And then sort of fusion phenomena start. Right? So people may make this kind of shape, but using the local clay or the local recipe. Or they may choose to experiment with a different temper, but they still make these kinds of style pots. Okay? Then it all normalizes. Right? And then it will start again. So poof. Somebody here experimenting technologically, doing what the people doing in the Jura Mountains, but this time making cortaillot-style pots. Okay. So there's a constant influx of people. And if you now look at the houses along the lake shore and how they are affiliated culturally, you can see that they're all the neighbors, they're all doing different things. So some do NMB, some do mixed, some do cortaillot. They just live next to each other without it being a problem. If we look at the clay paste recipe, you can see that they fall into much neater groups. Right? So how this has been interpreted by the excavator, by Burri, she says, well, there are all these people who are making pots in these houses. They sit out on the front door together, and they make the pottery together. They prepare the paste together, maybe they fire it together. Right? Similarly, these people. So that's why they're all similar. They then all make the pots that they like, the shape that they like, but they do it together. So here we have integration not in ritual, because we know very little about the ritual life of these communities. They're very prosaic, right? They're Swiss. But through daily life. All right? And all this is on the basis of continued mobility in the landscape, but a sort of also a little bit predictable mobility. Right? So we have these villages that are moving within a circumscribed territory, right? And are reforming and splitting and recombining within this area. And they're also managing this landscape. So there is no stability at all at the level of the household or at the level of the site, but there is some stability in the level of the landscape, and that it is managed. And we can see that people have these cycles of forest regeneration, where they first burn the forest for their fields, right? And then they let the cattle graze on it, and then they encourage trees that they need for building. Right? And when this has sort of re-established a little bit, then the cycle will begin again. So the stability is more in a sort of macro level rather than at the individual level. And this is also, again, ethnographically not uncommon. Right? So even people, this is the United States, the Southwest this time, the Pueblo tradition. And even though these villages at the time of the Spanish conquest, for example, and also later, look very, very monumental, like people really have made an effort to build these villages to stay there. For the Pueblo people, these villages are not where they will always stay. Right? In their mythology, they are looking for their original homeland, and they know that sooner or later they will migrate again. Right? Lots of households migrate generally all the time between this, so there's a constantly splitting off of some people. But every few generations, this whole village will just be abandoned and moved somewhere else. In this society, again, there is a sort of double key to integration. One is the living together and the making irrigation plans and so on. And here again, though, it's a very strong focus on ritual and on mythology as a key to integration, which we don't see in the Alpine Foreland. But we see that these sorts of unstable social systems, they are possible, they're quite frequent, and they are actually, in a broader level, quite stable. Like this, they have kept up for hundreds and hundreds of years, as far as we know. Okay, so here in the Alpine Foreland, this constant mobility is probably just a good adapted way of life to what is a very active and quite difficult environment. Okay. Every now and again, we see that there are these larger migrations across the mountains, across the cultural boundary, that causes sort of interactions that we can trace in the pottery in this case. But in general, this happens on a background of everybody being, in any case, quite movable over the landscape. Right? And it's maybe this constant mobility that is causing this particular brand of the Neolithic to have virtually no signs of any hierarchical relations. There's some that are very subtle, but there are no rich graves, there are no monuments like enclosures or anything like this until much later on. The houses more or less have the same inventory. Okay? So in this sense, mobility maybe also is something, because everybody can leave whenever they want, that prevents static hierarchies from even forming. But we're going to come back to that on Wednesday, if you're coming back on Wednesday. And so here we know very little about rituals, but we do seem to see shared routines, for example, making pottery, that work for integrating all these very diverse people into a common daily existence. Do you want 5 minutes break? Or are you happy? Carry on. You're happy. They are good. No one's falling asleep. Okay, then we'll do the cordetware. So the cordetware was another one of these large-scale migrations that had been debated, research historically in archaeology for a very long time. It was always meant to be a big migration. Then in the 80s and 90s, there was a push against that. We said, oh no, this is just a new way of burial. This is a kind of elite network like the Bell Beaker. And then geneticists arrived and found that there was a big change at this point in the genetic makeup of the European population, effectively creating the basis for our modern-day European gene pool. That means there's a little bit of hunter-gatherer, a little bit of the original sort of LBK farmer, and then a big influx from initially unknown somewhere in the steppes. Right? They're trying to trace down where. But so this big influx, okay? And it was originally then argued, especially in 2015 or thereabouts, that this was a massive migration. And because it was so massive, archaeologists, or some archaeologists, became very excited by it and decided to hang all the possible changes that they could think of on this convenient hook. Okay? So this became a gendered migration that was driven by male warriors introducing, of course, the new battle axes. And this is where the most murderous people of all time came from in the headline I showed you at the start. So there was an idea that they all come in, steal the local women, and then there you are. The men all die. Right? These homogeneous traditions with clear Eastern roots, like a new style of burial, of individual burial, with pottery, with the battle axe, and with a clearly gendered positioning in the graves. Okay? It was supposed to be the introduction of the nuclear family as a new way of organizing society, so that people would no longer live in big sort of clans, but now like father, mother, children, and a dog would live together. And this was the new basis of the social group. The economy was supposed to change from a largely agricultural-based to a more herding-based economy, so a more mobile way of life in the European languages, of course, why not, at the same time. And because this transformation became bigger and bigger and bigger, we also needed bigger and bigger reasons of why it could be so big. All right, so one was the plague. The idea was that somewhere here, right, in the northern Black Sea zone, where we have these big Tripilia mega sites where lots and lots of people live, new infectious diseases would start, a form of the plague, Yersinia pestis, and this would spread into Europe and effectively empty out the continent, right, and leaving it empty for these steppe people to come in. This model was later revised because, on the one hand, the plague was shown to be much earlier than the Tripilia megasite in some parts. It's also been shown to be probably much less deadly than the medieval one, all right? But also, it was definitely something that Eastern and Western groups shared. So it's not like the model had been like, Europeans arriving in the United States and all the Native Americans dying of the common cold or whatever because they didn't have any resistance. But this was very much a shared problem. So it's unlikely to have had this big demographic impact. So then we thought about a decline of the Neolithic economy and whatever, but we have still not found the smoking gun of what would have caused this part of Europe to entirely empty of its population, and it's unlikely that we will ever find it. Okay. Instead, what we actually see when we look more closely is that there is a lot more interaction between these incomers who undoubtedly existed. Like, no one's denying that there was a big migration. But interaction between these incomers and the people who actually live there, which has caused very distinctive regional flavors to this migration. So in Switzerland, because it is Switzerland, nothing at all changes. The only thing that changes is the pottery. They start making corded ware pottery with abandon, right? But everything else, the economic system, the lake village system, that remains exactly as it was. The stone procurement. In the Baltic, there's still a large role of fishing because you can't really survive up there if you don't eat the fish. So these newcomers must have learned all these techniques from somewhere. Right? They're unlikely to have learned about deep sea fishing somewhere on the Russian steppes. So there must have been some interaction there to make this, in spite of, again, of the adoption of pottery, to make this continuity happen. Right? In Jutland, so this part of Denmark, it's a particularly complicated situation because you have 3 different cultural groups coexisting in different parts of the landscape. So you have effectively hunter-gatherers of the so-called pitted ware culture making these big tips for shooting marine mammals that are living on the coast. Right? And then you have the corded ware kinds of migrants here, the single grave culture, on the west coast. And then you have continuing megalithic using societies on the east coast, so heaven knows how they all get on. In the Netherlands, you see a transition, or rather a slow incorporation of new kinds of pottery styles into the existing repertoire, but there's a blending. Okay? And also, even if you just look at how this burial rite pans out, then you see that over these different regions, it's not actually that unitary. Different pots are chosen to go in the grave, that's the different colors. But also the orientations and the positions and so on are varied. So it's not actually so simple as the big migration that sweeps in and changes everything. And in fact, as there have been new and more regionally based genetic results, they also show a similar thing. So Furtwängler et al. Have shown that in the Alpine Foreland, there is long-term coexistence between those two groups. This one here is Papach et al., where again, there is clearly a big influx of this new sort of step DNA, but that doesn't mean that the rest of it disappears, and there's also changes in mobility potentially before then. So they now reconstruct a much more complex and longer-term interaction process that also continues a little bit afterwards as well. Okay, and so here, as a in-depth case study, I'd like to take you to Norway a little bit, seeing as I've come from there. But Norway is a very complicated case to study this, because on the one hand, agriculture in Norway, it's not a good idea. Right? It's very pretty, but as you can see, the spaces for actually agricultural production are very limited. It's a little bit better on the coast, but in the fjords, it's horrific. I mean, please come and visit, they're lovely, but don't try and grow cereals there. Okay? So, and this is the extent of modern day productive agricultural land. So there, that's less than 2% of the country. The country's not even all of it on there. So it's likely to have been a little bit less dramatic in prehistory because, of course, smaller spaces can be used. So there is a little bit sort of, up there. We have agricultural production until about here. Right? But it's difficult. Okay. So this is really the edge of what is possible with Neolithic means. And here we have our Neolithic chronology. So we have the Mesolithic that goes until about 4000 BC. And then we have started calling it the Neolithic. But I can tell you right now that this is cheating. Okay? We've called it the Neolithic because in Denmark they have it and it starts at 4000. So we needed to have it. But our definition of the Neolithic is that they start using a different kind of raw material for their chipped stone tools. Farming actually happens there, 2350. Okay? Or mostly. Actually, because this landscape is so fragmented, also the early Neolithic is a little bit fragmented. So we see in the Oslo Fjord area, so Oslo is here, and here you see this sort of scarlet fever breaking out. All these red dots are imported flint axes from Denmark. So these fantastic things there. Okay, these are not locally made because there's no local flint in Norway anymore. There's a little bit from the glaciation, but they run out very soon. Right, so there we have the potential of a little bit of an incoming migration. There are, I think, now 5 megalithic tombs, and we use megalithic in a very loose sense, but 5 sort of stone kists. And there is a little bit of evidence that they're trying something like agriculture. Right? So there's a few kind of pollen cores that suggest an opening of the landscape. And there is the introduction of cord-stamped pottery, not corded ware, but a sort of late Trichterbecher, late Funnelbeker kind of cord stamp. That's the stars. Okay? But you can see most of this is there. And then some of these things travel around the coast, right? Because nobody really likes to live in here. But they go around the coast a little bit to kind of there, and then it becomes very, very thin indeed. So on the west coast, people continue effectively a Mesolithic lifestyle. They sit on the coast, they have all this lovely fishing equipment, the net sinkers and the line weights and the fish hooks and all this kind of stuff. They occasionally get an imported Funnelbeker axe, and then they use it to make chipped stone tools because they are barbarians. They import slate from the north, so slate is what you would normally put on roofs. It's a green-grey material that you polish, that you grind. Okay? But nothing really changes over on this side at all. Bergen is approximately there. Nothing really happens there. Until then, we see 2350 BC, again leaning on the Danish chronology, we see a big change. And now suddenly we see the introduction of a new style of flint working technology, giving us these lovely arrowheads that would not be out of place elsewhere in Europe either. Okay, we don't, that fit into this wider level of sort of corded ware / bell beaker style. We finally get longhouses. Here you see like 2 of them crossing and 1 of them over there. You don't see 2 of them crossing here, so there is some kind of longer term use of this particular farm. We see finally macro remains of cereals, okay? But it's not really just an agricultural economy because the landscape is so challenging. They're also relying to a very, very large extent on herding, especially sheep and goats, but also cattle. And they have to rely to a large extent also on fishing. Right? You can never quite give that up because the fishing resources on the west coast, they are fantastic. So in the Mesolithic, people use maybe 85% based on the isotopes, marine resources. So those are very, very rich compared to what you have on the land. And even these early farmers can't quite give that up. Right? So they bring with them a little bit of metal working as well, maybe. But this is not really, so these are the new elements that are introduced, but this is not really how it was at home in Denmark either, because there's a lot of things that do not make it. In Denmark at this time, we have a blending of corded ware and bell beaker, okay? But neither of the ceramics make it. Right? We have 1 bell beaker from Norway, 1, at a site called Sletterbø, here it is, and that's the only one. So we think a passing ship must have thrown it onto the shore, because the local pottery continues to be made in a really thick, generally undecorated, sometimes with a few kind of impressions on it, but generally undecorated, kind of meh sort of way. And then eventually they stop making it altogether, as I'm sure you know, in the later part of prehistory. We don't really have any characteristic burials of either corded ware or bell beaker style. Okay, we have this one that's supposed to be early, Mjeltehaugen, but it's a very old excavation, so the dating is debated. Some people think it's Bronze Age. Some people think it dates to this late Neolithic. Even if it is late Neolithic, it's hardly a classic corded ware or bell beaker burial because it's lots and lots of stone kists. Okay, no bone preservation, unfortunately, very acidic, nasty soils. Right? But lots and lots of these kists under 1 mound, so it's hardly usual. Okay? And we certainly do not have so many nice axes from something that could be graves or so many archery equipment either. So we have this item here, which has often been called a wrist guard, a bell beaker wrist guard. But this is to scale with real wrist guards from the continent, like it's 2 centimeters. It's not much of a wrist guard. It's probably a button, I'd say. So they've been very, very selective in the kind of identity-carrying artifacts that they bring with them. None of the classic bell beaker or corded ware burial rites and so on are actually there. Okay. In some, we've tried to sort of see where the similarities and differences are. Okay. And you see here southwestern and southeastern Norway, and here is supposed to be the big transition, this line. But you can see that some things indeed start then. Right? So new kinds of arrowheads, new kinds of flint making start here. Right? We have our 1 bell beaker. Right? We have maybe our Mjeltehaugen burial here. Right? But there's also lots of things that simply continue without it being no real change in how pottery is made. The forest clearance, yes, it's increasing, but it's been increasing for some time before, right? This is a much longer term trend. Okay? And other things like longhouses are really only common quite a substantial amount of time later. There's a few here, but it takes a while for it to become the new normal. So how we have reconstructed this is to say, well, it's likely that this new farming lifestyle is indeed brought by migration, because it is quite a neat little package, the longhouse, the sheep, the cereal grains. Okay? But there's initially not very many of these migrants. Right? So I'm almost forming little farming islands in what is effectively still a country of hunter-gatherers, right? And it's this interaction with the local hunter-gatherers that also helps them adapt their farming economy to these really quite challenging circumstances. And they learn about the hunting and especially the fishing resources that are still open to them, right? But they're also, as they're moving, they're not transplanting their cultural identity from likely Denmark one-on-one onto the Norwegian coast, okay? They've dropped a lot of these identity-defining artifacts. They're making a distinction. We're no longer the people from down there. We're now new people here. All right, so this is a kind of migration where I think you can see a new identity also forming for the migrants. And they're not of this place. They're now of the new place, right? And they maintain contacts in all directions, to the south where they came from, but also to the east with the amber, and they continue also importing slate from the north. Right, so here we can say this is maybe an ethnogenesis, and eventually this fusion process causes farming to become a much more mainstream practice. But it takes several centuries for this to happen, and it's unlikely to have been this sort of aggressive process. At the very last one, though, in order to not be just nicey-nicey, we've talked a lot about migration, but we've not talked so much about who might be migrating. Maybe it's women and so on and so on. Maybe it's male warriors. But in these last 10 minutes, I'd like to also to think about children and juveniles as particularly central agents in migration, because they do pop up again and again. So in the Bandkeramik, for example, on some sites, this is Niedermölln in Hessen. Right? We see here the main range of the soil strontium, and there's one group of people that consistently fall outside this local range, and these turn out to be mostly older children. Now, the excavators found this very, very hard to explain, okay? Because, you know, why would the children be the foreign ones? Right? Why would they be born elsewhere? Surely children have a lot less time than adults to undertake migration. But actually, in the years after 2009, since then, we found that, in fact, children very often do migrate. Well, not all of them, obviously, but that they're very often amongst the non-local people in a cemetery. So this is now Gurgy in northern France, a little bit later than the Bandkeramik. And here they have succeeded in making a big pedigree of all of the people on the site. They had very good bone preservation. And most of these people are somehow genetically related to each other. Again, some of them are missing, but we have these several big family groups. And then there's a bunch of people who are not related to anybody. And amongst them is this double burial of a brother and sister who are about 7 and 4 years old, let's say, give or take. Right? They're not related to anyone else on site. They have had a different diet, which suggests that they have moved in from a different landscape zone. But they have been buried in the very idiosyncratic burial style of this particular community, in this very tightly crouched with no grave goods, which for this time and this place is more or less unique to Gurgy. So they have been fully integrated into this community. And so the question is, how did they get there? Of course, we know ethnographically there is a lot of adoption. There is a lot of fostering, so it's quite usual in some societies for children of a certain age to be sent elsewhere to sort of very far away relatives or trading contacts to learn other skills, right? Especially in Western Africa, for example. Almost all the children, sort of 80%, spend several years away from their native family in their early teens, because it's thought that then they are particularly, difficult. The early teens are difficult, and the parents would only spoil the children, so it's best for them if they are sent elsewhere to learn other things. Right? So it could be something like this. However, it's also true that children very often, when groups meet, and they meet in a sort of unfriendly fashion, children and young people are very often sort of at the forefront of these encounters. So if you look a little bit later at the Salzmunde enclosure in Germany, this is very much known, you probably know it, for its many, many different and highly unusual graves. And some of these have been called sherd graves. These are generally very deep pits with the deceased on the bottom, and then you have several layers of pottery that has been burned secondarily, that has sometimes been hit, like that has been deliberately fragmented. There's burned daub and all sorts of things, but it's mostly pottery, many kilograms of it, that has been placed in these pits. And these shared burials, even though they are, in terms of the material, the richest burials on the site, very often have had rather unusual and sometimes traumatic biographies. So some of them have been very ill, for example. Here is one of these shared graves that is 9 individuals, right? 4 adult women and 4 children. And a neonate, so 5 children in total. And each of the women is holding, cradling one of the children. So again, upon excavation, it was thought these are mothers and their child that have been buried. But it turned out that none of the women can be the biological mother of the child that they are holding, and that some of the children even have haplogroups that are entirely otherwise absent on site. So these are very much external children. Right? So why are they all buried together? One theory is that they all died during a house fire. There seems to be a little bit of burning at some of the parts where the bones are most exposed to the surface. But nobody really can quite explain it. None of these people appear to have traumata on them, right? But something clearly caused their death. And they still have been arranged like, showing close social bonds, even though genetically they are not. And then somebody came and stole a head as well, a little bit later. So these are children that seem to be maybe incorporated into this community, but their circumstances of death are a little bit dodgy. And then we have this lady. This is a young adult, sort of 20 to 25, but she's likely been living in Salzmünde for a long time, so she probably arrived there as a late teenager. Okay? And the reason we think this is that she's had many years of really a bad life. Okay? Very hard physical work, very big muscle attachments, okay? Episodes of malnutrition, so not enough to eat. Okay? Several healed injuries on the skull. A few weeks before she died, somebody broke her mandible, and then eventually they killed her. So here are the healed injuries, but then eventually they killed her. And exposed the body, so there's bite marks on it, right? And then they put it into the shared grave, but then they dug it up again and distributed it, right? So she wasn't allowed to rest in peace. So here, I think we rather see the more nasty side of potentially different communities meeting, which is that you can take war captives and you can then treat them badly for an extended period of time, and also then kill them when you feel like it or when it's demanded in religion. And this is also something that we see across basically all the modern European empires, for example, but also Chinese expansions or the Aztec expansions and so on. That very often it is children and young people who are targeted in this way, because on the one hand, they're seen as very much helpless and defenseless. On the other hand, they're also malleable. So you can abduct them, and the younger these people are, the easier it is to incorporate them into your own community and make your own community stronger. Okay? So the Spanish, for example, when they moved into Mexico, they abducted children to bring back to Spain to teach them Spanish and turn them into missionaries to then go back and proselytize their own native communities. Or they used them as translators, like La Malinche or Valencin, who's the very famous example here. Okay? So very often it's children who are at the front line when people move and clash together. Right? So, but there's a wide spread, sometimes adoption and fosterage, and sometimes these really much more nasty encounters. Okay, so in conclusion, migration and mobility are not unusual behaviors. They're not just for people who don't find any other way out. They're very common strategies, and they can happen for a variety of purposes, including, for example, resisting hierarchies, okay? Or it can happen because of abduction, or it can happen because it is inbuilt in your economic systems and so on. So we need to reduce these big culture blobs that we have right down to our much more individual and small-scale encounters, and all these new techniques and methods that we have now allow us to do that. We just have to look for that. We have to go away from these large-scale headlines and look down at the specific case study. All right? And I would argue personally that sometimes this also allows us to define boundaries where people are signaling a different identity from others. Right? But these are not the same as the cultural blob boundaries. Right? And in spite of all this, people will also always find processes of integrating outsiders into their community in one way or another. And I think this is where we need to now do a lot more research as archaeologists. Right? And I'd like to leave you with one more ethnographic example of the early United States settler migrations from Europe into the Great Lakes region. I remember I told you initially about the Brothertown Indians, so different Native American tribes who were being demographically challenged, moved into these new communities. And this is one of them, Shamokin, where people from lots of different backgrounds were living together and were trying to make up a new community out of very different traditions, different family structures, different economic structures, and so on. And in this mix then also arrived translators, Madame Montour, and missionaries like Anna Mack. So a very multicultural place. There was a lot of drinking. So in fact, some missionaries called it the seat of the Prince of Darkness because there was so much rowdiness going on. There were all these different languages being spoken. But it was quite a stable community. Right? At the personal level, if people managed to figure out how the different family systems could fit together, right, they could make it work there for several generations. So these accommodations can be reached. And I think this is a much better model for a lot of prehistory than these villages that we think of with very homogeneous people living inside them. Right? So rather than cultural blobs, I think we need to think of prehistory as slightly drunk people trying to make it up as they go along, a little bit like us. So first of all, thank you for listening. And if you have time before you leave, you can leave me a little note. You can write it in whatever language you can, Peter can translate it later, of whether you think ethnicity as constructed concept would be useful for you as you go further to study your own Neolithic. But thank you very much.